After reordering her ranks, Ludmilla reviewed the impromptu battle in her mind. Ultimately, what had destabilized it was the appearance of the new officers. "Your Majesty," she asked, "what are these red skeleton warriors?" "They're red skeleton warriors." She looked up at him, unable to keep the dubious expression from her face. "Really? I didn't come up with the name." His tone turned defensive. "That's just what they're called. Besides, they're skeleton warriors that are red, so what's wrong with red skeleton warrior?" "If Lord Ines says that they are red," Lady Shaltier said, "then they are red. Even if they're blue, I mean, red." "No, wait." Ludmilla's gaze traveled to Lady Shaltier, then back to the Sorcerer King. The Sorcerer King's gaze traveled to Lady Shaltier, then back to Ludmilla. "If they're blue," His Majesty said, "then they're blue. Even if I say that they are red. Unless we're pretending that they're red for some reason, at any rate, I do not like that way of thinking. I would rather people think for themselves." "But they are red skeleton warriors." "Yes." "I see. Then are there any notable differences between skeleton warriors and red skeleton warriors?" "Well, they're red, so they go faster. They're a higher level variant of skeleton warriors, so they're stronger in general." Did changing the color of a skeleton warrior really make it stronger? She should have given the request to paint her undead laborers more serious thought. Leanne always had her favorite wagons painted red, too. Does this difference in strength account for how much damage they were dealing to the blood-meat hulks? It does not. What you've noted is the result of attack skills. As your opponents, even mindless ones, increase in level, things become more difficult not only because of increases in raw power, but also because skills start coming into play more frequently. So these red skeleton warriors aren't using martial arts? Though the effects they might produce are similar, attack skills and martial arts are not the same. Martial arts are resource-dependent, while the attack skills you see used by the red skeleton warriors are timer-based. Generally speaking, basic attack skills have shorter times. As with other skills you may know about, with increased power comes longer timers or more specific conditions. The most powerful attack skills can only be used a few times per day or less. Between strike arts and attack skills, which is better? His Majesty crossed his arms, and silence fell between them. A slender finger tapped on his forearm as he seemed to consider her question. "I believe that there are advantages and disadvantages to both," he said after several moments. "Martial arts take time to develop, but it appears that one can develop them in any direction. They are limited by resources, stamina, focus, and such, but do not have timers. As such, they may be employed in rapid succession or even combined to create even more powerful attacks." The Sorcerer King gestured to one of the red skeleton warriors nearby. "These red skeleton warriors manifest with skills and require no training to use them. Those skills will always be the same, however. Once one fights a red skeleton warrior, they know what every red skeleton warrior is capable of. Skills do not require resources, but the timer can make the user predictable. This is a weakness that may be exploited by opponents and particularly true for mindless creatures like these undead, who will always go all out." Ludmilla nodded and examined the two red skeleton warriors that had been added to her company, resuming her evaluation of their performance. Though she had intended on using the blood-meat hulks as heavy infantry, the red skeleton warriors had demonstrated themselves to be the superior option. Disadvantages she should have considered when fighting against the blood-meat hulks made themselves clear to her now that she was employing them. Their attacks were slow and unwieldy, making it close to impossible to fight effectively in a formation. The size of each was a huge detriment. 3 skeleton warriors could fit in the space of 1 blood-meat hulk, resulting in higher overall damage, flexibility and functional infantry ranks. The size, mass, raw durability and regenerative capabilities of the blood-meat hulks were, at a glance, ideal traits for a front-line role. A single skirmish had definitively proven this carelessly conceived notion to be flawed. Now that she had been ousted from her entrenched line of thought, Ludmilla realized what they were actually ideal for. Despite their appearance and relatively slow acceleration, blood-meat hulks could be employed like heavy cavalry. Their traits were ideal for smashing apart formations. Rather than have them stand and fight, relying on their slow, unwieldy attacks, they simply needed to keep moving. They were huge masses of mobile flesh, undead battering rams. Once they finished trampling their way through the enemy, They would continue out of harm's reach and regenerate the damage they had accumulated while setting up their next charge. The idea was not without problems, however. Foremost was the use of defensive arts like Fortress to stop them in their tracks. This was probably a standard answer to all cavalry charges, so she would have to look into how cavalry wings dealt with it. Strike arts like Called Shot would also make Blood Meat Hulks laughably slow and an easy target for archer companies to whittle down. A single archer and the company using glass arrows filled with holy water would disable the Blood Meat Hulk's regeneration, making it even easier to get rid of. There also existed many magical options that could hamper or arrest their advance. As with many things, it seemed that mundane martial thinking was invariably thwarted once magic and martial arts came into play. Manuals describing mundane tactics were commonly available to those that had an interest in them, but anything beyond that was in the realm of national secrets. What was clear was that, barring tremendous gaps in power, unsophisticated approaches became less reliable the stronger combatants became. This was true for individuals and armies alike. At some point, Ludmilla thought that the Sorceress Kingdom's relationship with the Empire would become amicable enough that she could gain access to information about the Imperial legions and how they operated. For the time being, however, her focus was still on domestic affairs and she would have to puzzle things out at home. Or maybe she would find some inspiration on their excursion. Ludmilla walked up to the front of the garrison again, examining the extent of its external damage. It stuck out strangely amidst the rest of the ruins around the plaza, which were essentially leveled and left as piles of rubble. The building felt more like the ruined towers that had somehow survived longer than the surrounding structures. Though what they had come across so far left her with severe doubts over finding anything, coming across a training manual or even a piece of fiction that hinted at the military thinking of the age would be nice. She scaled the steps to the entrance, concealing her presence and poking her head through the archway of its ruined gate. The hallway inside had the look of being left long undisturbed. Piles of dust and rubble had been kicked up by the swarm of skeleton warriors that rushed out at her shout. The right corridor and main hallway had caved in, so she made her way left past what appeared to be a waiting area and entered an attached office. A quick check through the large room revealed that it, like the interiors of the towers, had been burned out. Something about how it looked seemed odd, however. Ludmilla left the office and continued making her way through the building. It was laid out in a way that one might expect a large garrison barracks would be. Halls for various activities were arrayed over the main floor, while the second floor had other halls for sleeping. Piles of ash and debris lay where furniture was once placed, and she could make out the rows of beds, closets and chests, their remains left untouched for untold ages. Roughly halfway through the second floor, she found the edge of where her shout had been loud enough to draw the occupants. After noting the number of red skeleton warriors mixed in with the regular ones, she returned to her company outside. "No boss yet, Do you believe that there might be something in there, Your Majesty?" "It does seem like our best shot so far," the Sorcerer King replied. "Did the undead you find inside match what I described earlier?" "I think so," Ludmilla nodded. "There are more red skeleton warriors on the second floor, but between what's left and the ones that we fought, the overall ratios appear to be similar to present-day army organization. There's one red skeleton warrior for every squad of 20, much like an army squad has a sergeant. There's a third floor that I didn't check, just in case there's a captain or two there that possesses intelligence." The Sorcerer King looked up at the garrison barracks, speaking with a curious note in his voice. "What makes you think that there might be two?" "There are enough undead in there for 2 companies. It could also be a particularly large company, but that would still mean it has lieutenants to command the wings." "You've embraced this idea of the arrangement of the undead mirroring what existed in life, I see." "The notion appears to hold out so far, Your Majesty," Ludmilla said. "At least in terms of how things are arranged. The fighting strength of this garrison is extraordinarily high. Before it was annexed, Irantal's militia consisted mostly of iron rank, I suppose that would be level 4 to 7, members. Veterans with decades of service might be level 8 to 10. These militia start at level 16, and the red skeleton warriors should be around level 20 to 22. It could be a choice assignment, the Sorcerer King offered. The Empire's First Legion is stationed in our winter, while the Imperial Earth Guard can be found at key institutions and government offices. Their strength still didn't match up. Veteran rank-and-file legionnaires were the equivalent of silver rank adventurers, while members of the Imperial Earth Guard were roughly gold rank. Going by Alessia's account in the few conversations that they had so far, the militia represented here would be a match for soldiers from the theocracy if the undead truly mirrored the strength of what once was. The idea that the Katza Plains was once a perfect place for human civilization lent weight to the possibility, but it could have just as easily been the barracks manifesting with soldiers that were stronger than the civilians outside. All that aside, His Majesty said, "What is your plan of attack, Miss Saradnik?" "I was going to surround the entrance and fight there," Ludmilla replied. "Doing so should provide our forces with an overwhelming advantage." "Is that so? Well, I'll leave it to you, then." Ludmilla went about ordering her preparations. With the various soldiers of her once well-rounded company being replaced by skeleton warriors, her forces consisted of 6 blood-meat hulks, 24 bone vultures, 60 skeleton warriors and 2 red skeleton warriors. She first had them go around the plaza collecting all the heavy stones they could find. Once she thought they had enough, she arranged half of her skeleton warriors in a semicircle around the entrance, 2 ranks deep. The other half of her skeleton warriors were divided into 2 archer formations. Her 2 red skeleton warriors stood in reserve to plug any unexpected holes that formed in her encirclement. With her skeletons in place, she directed the blood-meat hulks to gather the much larger pieces of rubble from the crumbled wall of the barracks. Contrary to what she had feared would happen, the disturbance that they created while doing so did not attract any undead. She had them pile their makeshift ranged weapons behind the center of the encircling ranks. Preparations complete, she sent in her wraith to draw out the undead on the 2nd floor. Several minutes passed in silence, and Ludmilla frowned. "Why isn't it coming out?" Floating above her, the Sorcerer King offered no reply. Ludmilla cast her voice to cover the entire building, ordering the wraith to return. After several more minutes, she concealed her presence and re-entered the barracks. On the 2nd floor, she found a number of skeleton warriors and a single red skeleton warrior bunched up in one of the sleeping areas. The wraith was nowhere to be found. Puzzled, but not wanting to delay things any longer, Ludmilla threw a rock at the clustered skeleton warriors and ran back outside. She made it to the rear of her lines well ahead of the angry ball of skeleton warriors, turning to see the first few trickle out. "Stay in formation," she ordered her front ranks. "Only attack enemies that come within striking distance." More enemy skeleton warriors spilled out of the gate. To her surprise, they did not fan out to attack the encirclement, instead attempting to head straight towards her until they or one of their fellow skeleton warriors was attacked. Ludmilla didn't miss the opportunity. "Blood-meat hulks," she shouted, "let loose." The blood-meat hulks raised their boulder-sized pieces of rubble over their heads, hurling them straight into the line of skeleton warriors trying to shove their way forward. Shattered bones sprayed against the stone wall of the barracks as the boulders left scores of broken undead in their wake. Using the reprieve, she switched out the damaged skeleton warriors from the front line with those in the archer formations, then left instructions with the rest to cycle their number in the same manner. With the gathered rocks on hand, the damaged skeleton warriors could continue attacking at a distance, but Ludmilla didn't want to alter how the enemy streaming out of the gate so neatly lined themselves up to be destroyed. When enough of them piled up that they started to crawl over one another, she ordered another barrage to devastating effect. In the wake of that attack, she sent her bone vultures to pick up the crippled remains of the skeleton warriors, sending them to fall to their deaths in the plaza. A silvery laugh of delight drifted down from above. "I'm definitely watching her battles with the living from now on," Lady Shultier said. "How expansive will her repertoire of terror be by the time we return, I wonder?" "I'd at least recommend that they surrender," Ludmilla replied. "But you would still conduct your battles in this manner?" the Sorcerer King asked. "Though standards may differ from species to species, the living generally have boundaries for conduct for whatever they're doing. This includes what is deemed acceptable in times of war." The skeleton warriors pouring out of the barracks built up again, and Ludmilla ordered another barrage to clear them. The debris piling up inside the encirclement was making it harder and harder for the enemy to push forward. "The answer is complicated," Ludmilla said. "If I'm not mistaken, Your Majesty is referring to how not only soldiers on the battlefield judge certain acts of war, but how those at large receive word of them and how it can influence public sentiment or be used to manipulate the political and diplomatic landscape." "The Sorceress Kingdom has a certain image to maintain. While I have come to understand that you conduct your battles efficiently, many will not perceive that efficiency in a positive light. As a noble and as a commander, I always strive to achieve what is outlined by our national policies. Frontier nobles are not so adept at matters beyond warfare and the management of their own territories, however. If I were confronted with a situation in which a high degree of political and diplomatic skill was required, I would rely on my friends. It is a battlefield that they are far better suited for. With the remainder of the garrison barracks' second floor cleared, Ludmilla inspected her new set of red skeleton warriors. Though they had little more than half of a blood-meat Hulk's health, nearly everything else about them was better. I've commanded undead with unused skills before, she said, but it was the area of effect taunt skill of a Death Knight. I've never tried to direct anything so precise as the skills that these red skeleton warriors have. Most summoners direct their pets using general instructions, the Sorcerer King told her. They leave skill and ability used to the discretion of the summon. There are cases where one might want to exercise more control, but for the most part, it's rare to see one manage things as you do. Then again, you're a commander and not a pet class. This preternatural ability may be related to the fact that you should be issuing commands the same way. She still hadn't figured how to issue commands. Nothing she did had even the slightest sense of feeling like a skill. The skills that these red skeleton warriors manifest with, can they be augmented with these commands that you speak of? I wonder about that. Ludmilla let out a long sigh at His Majesty's vague response. The corner of Lady Sholtier's lip turned down. Ludmilla. Her liege's tone lowered dangerously at Ludmilla's expression of discontent. The Sorcerer King held up a hand. It's fine, Sholtier, His Majesty said. There is a reason that I remain evasive with certain answers, Miss Saradnik. Abilities, martial arts, skills and spells are the product of development and research. Many unprecedented achievements result from the work of those who never knew something was supposed to be impossible. Much like how many do not utilize their job classes properly because they are ignorant of their existence, setting the wrong expectations can blind one to the paths that they might have otherwise explored. I am especially wary of influencing talented individuals who have already shown the ability to achieve the impossible, such as yourself. I have? You may not know it, but you have. You are a fountain of anomalies, Miss Saradnik, and it is anomalies that lead one to the discovery of new knowledge. Realizing the truth reflected in the Sorcerer King's wisdom, shame rose within Ludmilla. Though he had expressed his wish for her to be at ease and conduct herself more casually during the expedition, she was being too familiar with her sovereign. Beyond that, who was she to assume the motives of one who possessed incalculable wisdom and intellect? Ludmilla lowered her head solemnly. I apologize for my rudeness, Your Majesty, she said. Your servant was entirely ignorant of the depth of your concern. In that case, is there anything you can tell me? The names of the skills that they are using, perhaps? The names don't matter, he replied. I thought it might be something that you already understand. How many of the skills, abilities and martial arts personally developed by you have names? None, Your Majesty. A self-deprecating smile touched her lips. Though I will have to come up with them for the sake of reference. Just so, the Sorcerer King said. I doubt that these red skeleton warriors even know the names of the skills that they use. They are mindless, after all. What everyone else calls them is, as you say, a reference. Much like the undead employed in the Sorceress Kingdom, these dominated undead understand intent rather than specific words. She lowered her head again in acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to the building before them. Judging by its exterior, the third floor should be the last. There were no towers, though there were probably some undead manning the battlements. Activating her hairpin, she flew up to get a view of the roof. It turned out that the entire thing had collapsed onto the third floor. The absence of light in the smothering mist meant that no light streamed down from the second floor stairwell to indicate that the ceiling was open. She descended to take an inventory of the undead on the third floor, noting 24 skeleton warriors. As Ludmilla floated lower to check for any undead hidden in the corners of each room, a distinct shape in the dust of an office caught her attention. She reached down to pick it up, dusting it off to find an ornament wrought in burnished red metal. A spider lily. The negative energy clinging to the barracks suddenly condensed into the piece of jewelry. Ludmilla tossed it back to the ground in alarm. A corporeal form materialized around it, taking the appearance of a vaguely familiar-looking elf in light plate mail. Ludmilla came closer. "Hello?" A shining rapier appeared in the elf's hand. Ludmilla's eyes widened as the elf's figure blurred forward. "Fortress." The point of the gleaming blade stopped against Ludmilla's throat, and the elf's flowing red hair trailed forward from the momentum of her lunge. Ludmilla rose into the air, the sound of dozens of bony feet clattering all around as the skeleton warriors around the floor ran to the origin of her surprised shout. Her assailant did not pause to consider her next attack. She vaulted up to the top of the broken wall and threw herself bodily at Ludmilla. The collision drove them out over the plaza, and Ludmilla fought to stabilize herself. The elf wrapped her arms around her for a scant moment before phasing through Ludmilla's body to fall in front of her undead company. "Who are you?" Ludmilla called down to the elf. "Why are you attacking me?" An enraged hiss was her only response. The elf looked up at her and the shining rapier disappeared, replaced by a warbow. A flash filled Ludmilla's vision as an arrow of light was deflected by her equipment. More arrows followed in rapid succession. The Sorcerer King and Lady Sheltia flew over beside her. "I see that there was a captain after all," he said. "It doesn't seem like she wants to talk." "Can she talk?" Ludmilla rose slightly as another lunge almost nicked her foot. "I don't even know what kind of undead she is, just that she's a really angry one." "She's a type of undead not dissimilar to a revenant," His Majesty said. "A sword wraith. They're unrelated to the incorporeal wraiths that you're familiar with. Sword wraiths are presumably warriors whose will to fight was so great that they returned from the dead to seek battle once more. If she is what she appears to be, however, she should be at least as intelligent as well." "So it's a sword wraith that isn't a sword wraith?" "That seems to be the case. Still, there must be a reason why she attacked you." "I found an item on the ground, a clasp decorated with a spider lily." "That's probably why you were attacked," the Sorcerer King nodded. "Though why there's a sword wraith protecting a clasp is a mystery. Perhaps she failed to protect the owner and has lingered over one of their belongings ever since." Flashes of light continued throughout their conversation as the sword wraith loosed more arrows at her. The skeleton warriors from the third floor finally caught up with their captain, milling about on the broken pavement. "What will you do now, Miss Saradnik?" "If she's as intelligent as described, shouldn't dominating her offer a wealth of information?" "I figured you might want to fight her before that." The Sorcerer King seemed to shrug as he replied. Ludmilla frowned down at the ridiculously aggressive undead elf. "She's very strong," Ludmilla said. "Mid to high orichalcum, around level 24. "And how strong are you now?" "A bit stronger than these skeleton warriors below." "Oh, you've gained at least 2 levels since we started." His Majesty stroked his chin thoughtfully. "So a level 17 revenant, at the lowest, with your equipment versus a level 24 sword wraith. An offensive fighter whose attacks should be around level 27 or 28, well, it should be an enlightening experience. A platinum rank against an orichalcum rank? Just how strong was her equipment?" Ludmilla idly wondered if she could bury the sword wraith in her undead company. After some thought, she decided against it. Her death priests were already down to 2/3 of their mana capacity and they still had much of the city left to explore. The Sorcerer King dominated all of the skeleton warriors and cleared the area in front of the garrison barracks. Ludmilla floated over the makeshift arena, trying to figure out how to initiate the fight with the sword wraith below. The undead elf continued to ceaselessly lose her attacks. As she hovered lower, the elf's bow was replaced by her shining rapier. She launched herself into the same, blurring lunge as before, scraping the bottom of Ludmilla's boots. Flight magic was convenient, but she felt like it left her defenseless against opponents who had attacks to intercept her with when she attempted to close on them. The lunge was probably an attack skill. Advanced martial arts were conceptualized through their components, and Ludmilla suspected that skills were not much different. Rapier users were well known for their lunge attacks, and for some reason, the rapier users in the Adventurer Guild were the first to grasp martial arts with a charge component. She had never seen an adventurer direct such martial arts straight into the air before. However, it was possible. No one did it because they would take damage upon landing and it made one vulnerable to attacks as they fell to the ground. The point of the rapier missed the soles of her boots by several centimeters as the sword wraith lunged again. Ludmilla carefully observed her landing. The sword wraith did not lose any health, so it must have had some other skill or ability that allowed it to prevent damage from falling. Ludmilla dipped into range of the sword wraith's lunge skill, about 20 meters. It didn't immediately attack her. This must have been the delay between uses His Majesty had mentioned. 20 seconds after the previous attack, the next one glanced off one of her silhouettes. Equipping her new glaive, Ludmilla lowered herself into the gap between lunges, wary of any additional skills. Her backwards descent was meant to create space between herself and the sword wraith, but it easily outpaced her flight effect. 4 meters over the ground, Ludmilla changed her plan of attack, leveling out and continuing to fly backwards. The sword wraith lunged again. Evasion. Ludmilla's figure blurred to the side even as the sword wraith blurred past. She twisted in midair while the counter-art was still active, her glaive sweeping around in a wide arc. The softly glowing blade of her weapon sliced through nothing but mist. The sword wraith's lunge skill ended, landing the elf over 15 meters away. I suppose that wasn't going to work. Evasion allowed her to dodge the blindingly fast attack, but it didn't empower her counter with the same speed. Between closely matched opponents, an advanced martial art was usually required to enact an effective counterattack against another advanced martial art. The sword wraith spun on its heel and dashed towards her, weaving from one side to another as it approached. How is this mindless? Ludmilla activated ability boost and strengthened perception, relaxing slightly as her opponent's movements became easier to follow. While the sword wraith displayed single-minded aggression, the way it conducted its offense seemed anything but lacking in intelligence. She crossed the charging elf's path with a diagonal slash. The sword wraith's momentum did not change. She raised her rapier to guide Ludmilla's strike as she ducked under it. Ludmilla eyed the elf's shining blade, bringing the haft of her weapon across as she prepared to receive the force of the incoming strike. The strike she expected never came. As Ludmilla continued to eye the shining rapier, something punched her in the gut. She flew bodily, landing several meters away. Ludmilla only made it halfway up to her feet before the sword wraith lunged and sent her flying again. The wall of the garrison barracks trembled as she ricocheted off of it to tumble over the stones of the plaza. Light steps sounded in Ludmilla's hearing as her opponent closed on her. Fortress. There was no time to think. She could only act. The rapier stopped against Ludmilla's gorget and her foot lashed out, employing a strike art to drive her assailant away. In the seconds to the next lunge, Ludmilla shifted backwards to create more distance between them. She noted a poniard in the sword wraith's left hand just before it lunged again. Ludmilla used evasion, weaving a slash into her counterstroke. This time, she made sure that she was positioned at the end of the lunge skill's 20-meter range. Her glaive removed the sword wraith's right arm at the shoulder. The rapier clattered over the stones, but Ludmilla paid no attention to it as she recentered her weapon and launched a piercing strike. Her opponent raised the poniard in her left hand to parry, but the polearm blasted through the flimsy defense. The undead elf's weapon flew into the air and the blade of the glaive scored a deep gash into the sword wraith's side. Ludmilla imbued a slash into her draw cut, but she couldn't withdraw. The sword wraith ran forward with her recovery and Ludmilla felt something puncture her armpit. She felt an object being pulled out before the sword wraith's attempt at grappling Ludmilla caused it to phase through due to her freedom effect. Ludmilla turned and backed away again, eyeing her opponent warily. The sword wraith was holding a poniard in her left hand again. Where is she getting them from? The corporeal body of the undead elf did not have any visible scabbards on her form, only her armor. Ludmilla's eyes widened as the poniard shimmered, replaced by the shining rapier. Then she was sent flying again by the sword wraith's unexpected lunge. Ludmilla tumbled to a stop in front of her company and the sound of light steps sounded in the air again. Getting back to her feet, she glanced at the arm still lying on the ground. It wasn't holding the rapier anymore. Her gaze returned to her rapidly closing opponent, and she altered her grip on her glaive, placing her right hand near the blade of the weapon. Her opponent's weapon came forward in a vicious thrust, and Ludmilla caught the blade against her own. She worked the haft of the glaive like a lever, easily forcing her opponent's weapon aside. The rapier went over her shoulder and the sword wraith collided with her. Out of the corner of Ludmilla's eye, the hilt of the rapier shimmered, replaced once again by the poniard. The sword wraith's wrist twisted to drive the blade into the side of her neck, and Ludmilla pushed against her opponent's forearm with her own. She hooked the haft of her polearm behind the sword wraith's head and drove a knockback-imbued knee into her opponent's abdomen. The undead elf's hips rose 2 meters into the air, but the back of her head remained fixed against the haft of the glaive. Ludmilla heaved down on her weapon with both hands, driving the sword wraith face first into the plaza. Ludmilla took 2 steps back. A slash took off the undead elf's remaining arm above the elbow as she tried to right herself again. She came forward again to plant a boot against the back of the sword wraith's neck, pinning her to the ground. With her adversary subdued, Ludmilla let out a quiet sigh before turning her gaze up towards the Sorcerer King. "A fine display, Miss Radnik." The Sorcerer King brought his hands together, as if to clap. After several futile motions, he seemed to realize that he couldn't do it very well. He stared down at his bony hands for a moment before bringing one up to clear his throat. Ludmilla's lip twitched. His flustered actions were extraordinarily endearing. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said as the sword wraith continued to struggle beneath her. "I'm glad you asked me to make the attempt. I've learned much." "I admit that it was worrying at first," the Sorcerer King said, "but you pick up on things at an astonishing rate. You were afforded next to no time to think things out, that vaunted intuition of yours at work, I suppose?" She nodded in response. Ludmilla was still reviewing the fight in her mind, analyzing what she had done. "One could see how you absorbed information and created working solutions," His Majesty went on. "You went from having next to no experience or information about a significantly higher level opponent to securing victory. The 2 decisive sequences you used might be mistaken as a product of intricate calculation. How many moves ahead of your opponent were you?" "5, Your Majesty." "I can only imagine what went into that." Now that she thought about it, it sounded ridiculous. If someone in the Adventurer Guild openly claimed that they could predict the flow of a fast, chaotic engagement 5 moves ahead, they would be dismissed outright as a braggart. "If it wasn't for this equipment," she said, "I would be dead several times over. What you mentioned about skills having timers was instrumental, as well." "Let's not be so humble, Miss Radnik," the Sorcerer King chuckled. "You mentioned learning much, so I would like to hear your thoughts on the fight." Ludmilla opened her mouth to reply, but she was jostled slightly as the sword wraith thrashed under her boot. The Sorcerer King pointed a finger towards it. "Dominate undead." The sword wraith dematerialized. Ludmilla jerked abruptly as the foot that was holding it down struck the pavement. "Eh? What happened, Your Majesty?" I'm not sure. A contingency effect, perhaps?" Ludmilla knelt to retrieve the spider lily ornament that lay where the sword wraith once was. Her fingers stopped just before she touched it. "What's the matter?" the Sorcerer King asked. "This ornament was in a private room or office on the 3rd floor, Ludmilla answered. "The sword wraith manifested when I touched it." His Majesty looked down at the ornament on the ground. I don't see anything strange about it. As far as I can tell, it's just a regular piece of jewelry." Ludmilla touched the ornament with her fingertips. Nothing happened, so she picked it up and straightened to examine it. As before, the item looked nothing more than a well-fashioned piece of jewelry. "Did anything else happen when you handled it before?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Ludmilla replied. "A moment after I picked this up, all of the negative energy in the area was drawn into it. The sword wraith manifested following that and attacked me." "Something like an event trigger, or a trap? If it was the only thing you found up there, it would explain why it was left alone and why it seems like a mundane item now. Whatever it was imbued with was expended to manifest the sword wraith." "A trap left by the people who lived here, or whoever ruined it?" "Probably by the people who lived here," His Majesty said. "The only reason that whoever ruined it would lay a trap would be to protect something crucial that they couldn't destroy." Ludmilla eyed the garrison barracks. It was certainly something that weathered past events far better than anything else they had come across so far. She hadn't noticed anything else inside before being attacked, however. "If that's the case," she said, "I should go and take a closer look." Placing the ornament in her infinite haversack, she activated her flight item and rose over the barracks. This time, the Sorcerer King and Lady Sholtier followed. Ludmilla landed in the office where the sword wraith had manifested, crouching down to brush aside the piled-up dust with her hands. A light current of air played over her skirts as the Sorcerer King landed nearby, and her hand went to make sure it was still in place. Though the piece of armor so far behaved as Lady Sholtier had described, Ludmilla still couldn't trust such a short skirt. She was certain that the Sorcerer King had gotten a good glimpse a few times during her fight with the sword wraith. Flying was also a problem. Anyone below could just look up to get an eyeful. "Summon Monster 3. At the sound of the spell, Ludmilla looked up at the Sorcerer King. She frowned when she found herself facing a row of meter-tall water elementals. Summon a few as well, Shiltir. Summon Monster 3. Another row of 4 water elementals appeared. Lady Shiltir's crimson gaze went from the water elementals to Ludmilla, and she smiled. It would be better to just enjoy this, Lady Shiltir advised her. Well, resistance is also perfectly acceptable since you're into that. I'm not. The water elementals in front of the Sorcerer King started to move, swirling around rapidly as they swept over the floor. Only the stone floor was left in their wake. Lady Shiltir's mouth fell open. What are you doing, Shiltir? The Sorcerer King said, we've got a big mess to clean up. Right away, Lord Ines. Despite her energetic reply, Ludmilla thought she saw Lady Shiltir's shoulders slouch slightly in disappointment. Her water elementals joined His Majesty's as they roamed around the building. Ludmilla wasn't quite sure what to think about the Sorcerer King and his Minister of Transportation going around cleaning up an old dusty ruin. Did it count if they were using summons? Either way, anyone would express their disbelief if she mentioned it. That, or it would start some sort of trend. If Amelia finds out about this, Ludmilla watched the water elementals work, she's going to be adding another spell to her strange repertoire. Amelia, one of your maids? Yes, Your Majesty. With the availability of undead labor, my maids have started looking for other ways to be of use to the household. Amelia is studying to be a divine caster at the Uranthal Cathedral. I see, something along the lines of Pestonia or Lupus Regina then. I've not had the pleasure of making an acquaintance of Miss Lupus Regina, but Miss Pestonia may have been one of Amelia's inspirations. I've been healed and resurrected so many times by the royal housekeeper that Amelia might believe that we need someone to do that at home, as well. If anything, I thought you'd have maids who were arcane casters instead. Why is that, Your Majesty? It's because I suppose it struck me as natural for some reason. She wasn't sure why he would think it was natural to have arcane maids, but there was nothing stopping members of her household from studying arcane magic. They were scarce and in high demand for production fields, so it wouldn't be prudent to hire people who were already arcane casters for the time being. If a member of my household expresses an interest in arcane magic, she said, I'll be sure to encourage them to do so. With how spotless the water elementals were leaving the barracks, she imagined the households of nobles in the Sorceress Kingdom becoming even smaller. There was also the potential for nobles specializing their households into less traditional forms. As a militant noble, Ludmilla supposed it would become more traditional with the formation of a well-balanced armed retinue. A cursory inspection of the newly cleaned building revealed nothing. Ludmilla was in the process of looking for hidden compartments in the walls when a faint noise rose from somewhere below. The Sorcerer King and Lady Shiltir raised their heads in unison, as if sensing something. Did you check for an underground floor, Miss Zaradnik? The Sorcerer King asked. I didn't see the way to one if it exists, Your Majesty, Ludmilla answered. The water elementals are fighting something, he said. And now they're dead. The Sorcerer King glanced over to Lady Shiltir, who shook her head in reply. They went down to investigate the missing water elementals. On the second floor, Ludmilla searched for a way down that led to the blocked-off part of the first floor. As they walked down the corridor, the Sorcerer King stopped and placed his hand on the wall. So this is why the building survived. Your Majesty? This building uses enchanted materials, the Sorcerer King told her. My arcane vision can detect the mana coming off of this wall. The exterior of the building doesn't emanate any mana, but it seems that the interior does. Perhaps an attempt was made at destroying it, but they gave up at just the right moment. How much stronger do these enchanted materials make the building? Much more so. The rules that apply to enchanted equipment also apply to any material. Enchantments achievable by this region would turn a 10 cm thick stone wall as hard as mithril and just as durable. I've heard that local ritual magic makes even higher degrees of enchantment possible, so attacking a stone building enchanted in such a manner would be the same as attacking a structure built entirely out of adamantite. So that was the answer. Eh? Ah, my apologies, Your Majesty, Ludmilla lowered her head. The central administration issued some lofty building standards shortly after the duchy started returning to normal. We were to fortify key strategic positions against fifth-tier magic, but no one could figure out how to do that. The best I could come up with was planning my development in such a way that it was unreasonably mana inefficient to destroy even a village. In lieu of having advanced materials, the Sorcerer King nodded. I suppose that is a way. Enchantment has high costs associated with it, however. It is a testament to the prosperity of this city. This single building probably cost as much to enchant as it took for Riastais to build the entire city of Eranthal, fortifications included. The staggering amount of capital described caused Ludmilla to shrivel up internally. While it was true that she now had access to more wealth than she could have possibly imagined having just half a year ago, it was a pittance in comparison to the cost of enchanting the barracks that they stood in. So much for her fleeting dream of shiny new defenses for Warden's Vale. They found another way down from the second floor, which led to the area of the first that Ludmilla suspected led down to the basement. Several skeleton warriors stood at the top of the steps. She issued orders for her company to join them, minus the blood-meat hulks and bone vultures. The Sorcerer King eyed her skeleton warriors as they formed up in the corridor. "Ho, you're really doing this? Was something the matter, Your Majesty?" "Possibly. Let's see your approach first." Ludmilla positioned a half-dozen red skeleton warriors across the corridor, putting 2 more ranks of skeleton warriors behind them. She then tossed a stone at the nearest enemy undead, curious over what His Majesty's words meant. The shield bashes of the red skeleton warriors made short work of her opponents, while the bladed weapons of the attacking skeleton warriors inflicted minimal amounts of damage in return. When nothing further happened, she glanced back to her death priests. Their mana seemed like it was imperceptibly gaining. At their former rate, she was worried that they wouldn't be able to have enough mana to explore the entire city. Using the new red skeleton warriors, however, it felt like they could go on indefinitely. Her company's ranks parted to let her through, and she made her way down into the basement. She crossed the odd line that marked the extent of the water elemental's cleaning efforts, discovering more skeleton warriors beyond. With most of the basement level completely intact, it seemed a maze of holding areas, storage rooms and corridors. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, she returned to the main floor. "I take it that there aren't any undead of note down there." "Not that I noticed, Your Majesty." "A shame," he said. "I was hoping for a hidden boss or something along those lines." "What will you do, then?" "There are multiple corridors below," Ludmilla replied, leading to a variety of rooms. "Instead of trying to hold 3 or more routes, I figured it would be easier to bring everything up to the single strong defensive line here." The Sorcerer King raised a hand to his chin, stroking it thoughtfully. "I suppose that is an answer, as well." "If I may ask," Ludmilla said, "what were you considering, Your Majesty?" "It was the perspective of a pet class," he replied. "Fighting inside buildings can be quite troublesome. One needs to be careful of their surroundings and one cannot see what is behind every wall and door. One may also find that their pets have gone out of line of sight for spell targeting or run off somewhere. Commanders may face a similar situation," Ludmilla said. "In our case, a company commander would be entrusting this sort of task to their sergeants." "Or their captains," His Majesty said pointedly. Ludmilla considered the Sorcerer King's response. Her purpose here was to gain experience as a commander while they explored the Katsa Plains. "In a situation like this," she said, "it is confrontations with intelligent opponents that one should be concerned about. When storming fortified positions or clearing out stubborn defenders, those hold-up would not gleefully abandon their advantage simply because someone threw a rock at them." The undead below were no contest for her forces in their current position, and she would learn little from this rare opportunity if she enacted her current plan. "Umu. Though it would be more efficient to follow your original plan, the risks are such that you can explore other possibilities. The undead won't act like the living in this situation, but it is still an opportunity for practice." "I understand, Your Majesty," she said. "May I participate directly in combat?" "Of course," the Sorcerer King nodded. "That was never a restriction. You are a captain, after all." Ludmilla reorganized her company at the bottom of the stairs, arranging her red skeleton warriors to hold 2 of the 3 approaches while she would lead a squad of regular skeleton warriors down the last. The rest would be held in reserve, and her 2 death priests were left to manage the 2 defensive lines. With her makeshift headquarters established, she went on her way with the Sorcerer King and Lady Sheltir observing from behind. Indoor battles were far more challenging than she had estimated they would be. Even with her rear secured, Clearing the undead in one room would draw attention from others nearby. 2/3 of her squad had to stay behind to slow the rush of enemies. The need for speed and responsiveness became even more pressing than in a field battle. As she pushed to minimize the damage to her soldiers, techniques long drilled into her returned after what seemed like an age of neglect. Her glaive moved to hook legs and arms, bind weapons and pry shields out of place. The reach of her polearm allowed her to strike through the ranks of her allies, or diagonally into the exposed flanks of enemies to either side. Though mindless, her skeleton warriors seemed to take advantage of the opportunities that she made for them, and the results of her actions cascaded to sweep the opposition away. The extensive martial repertoire handed down to her by her family crystallized into a clear whole. Something stirred deep within Ludmilla as she continued to fight. Her actions were not the flamboyant and seemingly selfish moves of adventurers, they were the resolute will of a captain as she altered the fortunes of her company. A single company could change the course of a battle, and a single battle could turn the tides of war. The fate of nations, balanced on the edge of a single blade. So this is what it truly means. Ludmilla had heard it many times before, but she had never felt it until now. Tranquil warmth suffused her body, and her spirit resonated with the songs sung for untold generations. Undead she might be, but she still possessed the bloodline of soldiers. Be it in a basement, mountain pass or vast battlefield, this place, where she stood and fought beside her comrades in arms, was where she belonged. It was her heritage, what she and all of her ancestors had been born for. Verdant mantle flowing in her wake, Ludmilla stormed her way through the corridors. Time seemed to flow by unnoticed as she forged order out of chaos. Her company advanced, empowered by her presence. Reserves replaced the wounded who were sent back to her headquarters, but she never stopped carving a path forward. Before she knew it, she came face to face with a line of red skeleton warriors. Behind them were a pair of death priests. She had cleared a complete circuit around the garrison basement. "Well done," the Sorcerer King told her. "Now, are you all right, Miss Zaradnik?" Ludmilla turned her head to look at the Sorcerer King. Beside him, Lady Shiltia silently pointed a finger to her own face. The fingers of Ludmilla's gauntlet slid over her cheek, coming away wet with tears. She blinked as the heat waned away, sending fresh moisture down her cheeks. "I'm uninjured, Your Majesty." Her voice trailed off. Planting the base of her glaive on the floor, she genuflected before the Sorcerer King. "What's this?" he asked. "I don't know how else to express myself," Ludmilla answered. "All I can say is thank you. For so many months I've been doing something horribly wrong, but your guidance has set me on the right path. Thank you, Your Majesty." "The right path, And what path might that be?" "One that everyone else saw," she said. "They even pointed it out to me. It was in the actions and words of those all around. Yet I remained aloof. I knew the legends of old, the famous histories, but I only read them and remained a member of the audience. I am a noble born and a soldier bred, yet I blinded myself to my true calling, but no more." She looked up at the Sorcerer King, conviction welling up within her. "No longer will deny the path that I was meant to tread.